Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Okay, and so now we've come to the third class in the series. And the topic of the class today will be on karma and rebirth. And so in the last class, we spoke about the Four Noble Truths. And to really understand the Four Noble Truths in sort of depth and to understand them with their full implications, it's important to view them against what we might call the broader picture against which the Buddha's teaching unfolds. And that broader picture involves an understanding of what we call rebirth and of the particular dynamics or the laws that underlie the process of rebirth. And in order to approach this question, or this issue, this topic, I thought to begin by considering that there are three possible views, perhaps more, but at least three, maybe most prominent views of what happens to us at death or after death. So one of these is, can you see clearly in the back? Okay. So one of these is the view of philosophical materialism, which holds that the human person is essentially a combination of material constituents, material components, that sort of the essential factor of our existence is the physical body, which is the product of a long course of biological evolution, and the mind or consciousness is just a sort of chance byproduct of very complex interaction of material particles. And so when the physical body comes into being, perhaps at conception, perhaps during the process of fetal development, perhaps at birth, consciousness or mind arises. Consciousness or mind is completely dependent upon the physical organism, and mind will continue to function as long as the body is alive. And then with the death of the body, there's no longer a suitable physical organ that can support the functioning of consciousness. And so with the death of the body, consciousness comes to a complete end. Obliterated, nothing remains after death, except, we could say, the influence, the impact that the person has had on other people or other beings in their community, in their society, or their biological offspring. But as far as individual consciousness goes, it comes into being with the physical birth, and it completely is annihilated with the death of the body. This is the dominant view, we could say, in those branches of science that rely on completely naturalistic premises. And of course, the big problem for this point of view is how do we explain the arising of something that has the capacity for what I would call inward examination, inward self-examination, something that has the capacity for awareness of the world around it, something that's of a completely different type from physical phenomena, from chemicals and molecules and cells. Okay, and so even though scientists or those, let us say that this is a philosophical position based on science, it's not something that is a position that is completely determined and verified by science. It's really just a kind of philosophical interpretation of the discoveries of science. So we find that if the brain is affected in some way, that will affect the functioning of the mind, the functioning of consciousness. And so from this, one jumps to the assumption that consciousness is just a byproduct of brain or neurological function. But how does one explain something with the capacity for awareness on the basis of just a conglomeration of material particles? Perhaps it's possible, but the conclusion doesn't follow inevitably that through an assemblage of material particles, something utterly different like consciousness can arise. Okay, the other position, actually the materialistic position, is the one that should be called the one life theory. But what I mean here by one life theory should better be called one afterlife theory. So this would be sort of the position that we find maybe is characteristic of mainstream Christianity. So we live one life on earth, and our deeds and our faith in this life will determine our destiny forever in the afterlife. So if we have belief in a particular conception of God, if we have faith in a particular person as the proclaimed messenger, incarnation, prophet of that God, if we have faith in a particular set of scriptures, and if we follow the ethical injunctions of the teachers in that tradition, then at death we will go and spend eternity in heaven. And if we don't have faith, if we disparage and turn our backs on that God and denigrate his representatives and deny the truth of these scriptures and don't fulfill the ethical commandments of that religion, then we spend eternity in the dark place in hell. Of course, there's an intermediate position, which is that in the Roman Catholic religion of purgatory. But still, purgatory and what follows from purgatory is considered an extension of the single life that takes place after the death of our physical death here. Okay, the third position is that of multiple lives. That we don't, when we come into this life at birth, we're not coming out of nothing, but we come from a being in a previous life, a being that was in some sense the progenitor of ourself. And through our actions, through our deeds that we perform in this life, our consciousness is going to continue into a new existence in which we reap the consequences of our deeds in this life. And when that life comes to an end, it will be followed by still another life after that. And so life will succeed life without interruption. So that is the theory or the view of what is called rebirth, or sometimes called reincarnation. And this is the view which is actually characteristic of the main religions of India: Hinduism, Buddhism, and the less well-known religion, Jainism. The belief in reincarnation was also held by numbers of other religions around the world, religions and philosophies. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, the one who's famous for the Pythagorean theorem in geometry, was a proponent of reincarnation. And through the influence of Pythagoras, the great Greek philosopher Plato was an advocate of reincarnation. And so Plato influenced many of the Greek philosophers that followed him. And so the idea of reincarnation was actually quite a prominent theme in Greek philosophy. And there was even an early branch of Christianity prominent in northern Africa that adopted the idea of reincarnation in some form. But eventually that mode of thought was denounced by the official councils and then eliminated from Christianity. Okay, so of these three positions, the position that Buddhism adopts is that of multiple lives. But there's a difference between the significant difference between the Buddhist teaching of what we call rebirth and the teaching of reincarnation that's prominent in Hinduism. The difference is that the Hindu philosophy, the fundamental idea of the Hindu philosophy is that we possess a single, permanent, everlasting, unchanging self or soul. That is called the Atman. The self. And according to the Hindu philosophies, the self is permanent and unchanging, remains ever the same, but it migrates from body to body, retaining its identity. So the self is compared in the Hindu scripture called the Bhagavad Gita. The self is compared to a person who might put on one suit of clothes in the morning, then in the middle of the day changes to another suit of clothes, then in the evening changes to another suit of clothes, but the person remains the same, but the suits of clothing change. So that is the Hindu idea. The Atman, the self, is like the person, and the bodies are like the suits of clothes, taken up, discarded, a new one taken up, discarded. But the Atman, that core of the self, is always present, always the same. Okay, the Buddhist theory of, or doctrine of rebirth does not involve the belief in a permanent, unchanging self. As we're going to see next week, the Buddha teaches, in fact, that there is no single permanent entity that we can call the self. But what we call the person is always in process, always changing. And so the mind or consciousness is a process that's always changing, so that moments of consciousness, one moment of consciousness arises, passes away, followed by another moment of consciousness which arises, performs its function, passes away. And so the mind is this sequence, this succession of occasions of consciousness. So it's an ever-changing process, never remaining, without any kind of substantial entity that remains the same. But what Buddhism teaches is that at death, the process of consciousness doesn't come to an end, but rather the process of consciousness, when the process of consciousness arises on the basis of a physical body, and when this physical body can no longer biologically support the process of consciousness, then the body passes away. The body undergoes death, but consciousness does not come to an end. Rather, the consciousness will then, the stream of consciousness, the process of consciousness, will then move on and take up another physical organism. It will arise on the basis of a new physical organism. And that is what is called rebirth. It's the arising of the stream of consciousness based on a new physical organism. And so, for this reason, in Buddhism, we try to avoid the word reincarnation, though often it's used in common discourse. But when we come to the more technical level of discussion, then we avoid the word reincarnation, because that suggests that there is a self or soul that remains the same and takes on different incarnations, different embodiments. Instead, technically, in Buddhism, the word that we use is puna bhava. The word puna means again, and bhava means existence or becoming. So puna bhava is literally again becoming again and again, or taking on existence again and again. And I should say that for Buddhism, we don't regard this idea of rebirth as a kind of theme that we should weave romantic fantasies around. Like trying to come up with to ponder the question, what was I in my previous existence? Oh, I must have been a prince in ancient India, or a pharaoh in ancient Egypt, or a princess in Constantinople. Probably most of us in our past lives were just quite ordinary people working very lives of drudgery and hardship, marrying, getting children, having marital quarrels, having conflicts with our children. So there's nothing to romanticize the idea of rebirth. Okay, so what are some grounds, especially for us in the West, especially for people who have had a modern scientific education, the idea of rebirth sometimes seems rather strange, bizarre, outlandish. So what are some of the basis on which I would put let me speak from the personal standpoint, what are the basis on which I would place my belief in rebirth? And there are some people who claim to have rebirth memories. Whether those memories are true or not, that we can't say. And I would say, if you do have memories of previous lives, don't necessarily believe that they're true. They could be products of the deep unconscious, fantasies which are sort of coming into consciousness, and then you're adopting them and thinking, I must have been this, I must have been that in my previous life. So just because you have what seem to be memories of past lives doesn't necessarily make those memories valid. Okay, so what are the bases on which I would place my trust in the idea of rebirth? First, I say one ground, is the scriptural basis. And this is the basis that the Buddha himself taught rebirth. In his account of his own enlightenment, I included this with the text. He says that when my mind was concentrated, purified, cleansed, unblemished, rid of defilement, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, very calm, focused, unified mind, I directed it to the knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings. With the divine eye, I saw beings passing away and being reborn, inferior and superior, beautiful and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, and I understood how beings fare on in accordance with their karma. And then it goes on in more detail. And in many places in the Buddhist texts, we find the Buddha speaking about rebirth as something that he was able to witness for himself. And not only for himself, but also many of his foremost, most eminent disciples also were able to develop the recollection of their own past lives and also the ability to see the passing away and rebirth of others. And what keeps the knowledge of our own past lives away from us? What is sort of the big barrier separating them, these traces, memory traces of our past lives from our conscious awareness, is the fact that at death, it must be something of a traumatic experience which just obliterates the memory traces of the previous life. And then because our minds are ordinarily completely absorbed in present activities, and so we're not able to break through that barrier that separates the memories of past lives from conscious awareness. But by developing a very powerful, concentrated mind in meditation, then it's possible to send the mind back and to recollect in detail first the events of this life, even back to childhood, to infancy, even, as said, to the time of the womb, the time when we were embryos in the womb, and then to drive the consciousness back until it breaks through the barrier separating the moment of conception in this life from our passing away in the previous life. And then the memory will come back into awareness. And it's said that as one develops more and more skill in this, one can recollect an increasing number of past lives until one could even recollect hundreds, thousands of past lives. Okay, so one basis for my own trust and belief in the teaching of rebirth is the teachings that have come down in the Buddhist scriptures. And these teachings are repeated so often that we have to accept that this is what the Buddha himself actually taught. It's not some kind of stray passages that somebody else might have inserted into the Buddhist texts in order to make Buddhism seem like Hinduism. But the passages come so often that they seem to be part of the fundamental framework of the Buddha's teaching. Okay, a second ground is what I call rational ground. And this is using reason to try to give some credibility to the idea of rebirth. Though I don't think it's possible to prove the existence of past lives by the use of reason. But this is the kind of reasoning that I use to increase my confidence in the idea of past lives. Let us take, on the one hand, a person who is responsible for a lot of evil and suffering. I would take, let us say, I don't want to take the Hitler argument that's used too often, so we'll put that aside, but somebody who is the CEO of a weapons manufacturing corporation, manufacturing weapons of war in order to sell to other countries for them to conduct their wars. And as a CEO, he has a very lavish, very big salary, very lavish lifestyle, enjoys himself, all of the luxuries of life based on selling weapons to poorer countries to conduct wars. On the other hand, we have, let us say, a medical doctor who's living in a Western country, and she decides to dedicate her life to join an organization like Doctors Without Borders to work in a war-torn country, even putting her own life at risk to help people whose lives are endangered by the injuries from warfare. Okay, and at a certain point, both of them die. Okay, if materialism is true, it means that death, let's say, the executive of the weapons corporation lives a very comfortable, luxurious life till the end of his normal lifespan, then he dies. The woman doctor who's working in that war-torn country is killed as a result of a missile that falls on the hospital where she's working, and she dies. Okay, if materialism is true, and it might be true, but it would mean that for both of them, at death, the destiny is the same. They're both completely snuffed out, nothing beyond the death of their body. And yet for me, I find that sort of cuts against the grain of a deep moral intuition that there has to be some kind of, call it a principle of moral equilibrium in the world, by which deeds bring about their appropriate results. And for me, the most satisfying way to establish that moral equilibrium would not be an eternity of hell for one, an eternity of heaven for the other, but rather a renewal of existence, whereby consciousness will move in to a new embodied form and begin the life process again under conditions that would be appropriate, that would bring about the appropriate retribution for their respective ways of life. Does that make sense?
So does that mean the doctor would become a CEO and the CEO would become a...
No, that's a good question, but I would hope not. Okay, then the third ground on which I have trust in the teaching of rebirth is what I call the empirical. And this is evidence that has come through some investigations. There's a remarkable type of phenomena which has been actually investigated, and the cases have been recorded and compiled of children who, when they reach the age that they're able to speak, tell their parents, their biological parents, "You are not my only parents, but I used to live in such and such a town or village," and they'll say, "My parents were named so-and-so, and I had maybe 2 brothers and a sister, and we lived in a house that had let's say, a red roof," and they'll describe the conditions under which they've lived, and they'll describe the circumstances under which they died. And children who have these memories usually died, according to these cases, died prematurely in their previous life, when they were either children or teenagers. And a great number of these cases have been collected and quite rigorously investigated by a man who was formerly the chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Virginia. His name is Ian Stevenson, and he has published a large number of books in which he's compiled these cases, which he's investigated himself. So maybe the most accessible book is called, I think it's called 20 Cases of the Reincarnation Type, or 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And then there are some other scientists who have been continuing the work of Ian Stevenson. I think the one who's been conducting most of this work, his name is Jim Tucker. I think he's also at the University of Virginia. And so these cases are very, very difficult to explain in any other way except by contending that this child who's provided these details about a particular child who died earlier and who had such and such parents, lived in such and such a house, very difficult to explain these cases on any other ground, but that at least in these cases, reincarnation or rebirth has taken place. Okay, this continuity of existences, this process by which one life follows another life, and that is followed by another life and still another life. This is what we call in Buddhism samsara. I know samsara, the word samsara has now been almost absorbed into English. And I remember some years ago, there was even a perfume named samsara. But the word samsara comes from a verb. The verb is sangsarati, which means to run along, to roam on. And so samsara is the running along from birth to death, and then from death to new birth. Or it's the roaming on from life to life. And according to the Buddha, samsara is without any discoverable beginning. He says that there's no first point that can be found to this cycle of birth and death. And so here on earth, we've had living forms for so many billions of years, but Buddhism teaches that even world systems common to being, they take shape, they reach a certain point of maximum development, then they disintegrate and completely dissolve. And then out of the ruins of one world system, after some time, another world system will emerge, take shape, then eventually dissolve and disintegrate. And so in this way, world system follows world system, follows world system, without any beginning. And in this beginningless sequence of world systems, our own lives have been unfolding from one existence to the next existence to the next. And that is samsara. And as I explained, in the Buddhist view, there is individual identity in that the streams of consciousness are distinct. It's not just that maybe through my actions and words, I influence, say, these young monks here. So when I die, maybe let's say 10 years later I'll die, maybe longer, I don't know. So the image of my face and my words and my actions, they'll remember. And so it's not the case simply that I'm being reborn because I'm influencing their thinking, their ideas. But rather streams of consciousness are individual and continue on from life to life. But these streams of consciousness, as I said, are always changing, arising and passing away from moment to moment. And so this is compared to, maybe a good example to illustrate this would be a candle. So we have a candle, we have the wax base of the candle, we have the, what's that called, the string? The wick, thank you. And then the flame of the candle. Okay, so the flame is burning on the basis of the same base, the same candle. But the flame is always consuming new particles of the wick, new particles of oxygen. It's giving off carbon dioxide. And the flame is a process, always changing. And yet we call it the same flame because it's arising on the basis of the same wax. But even that wax of the candle, the base of the candle, is always dissolving and evaporating. Okay, when we get to the very bottom of the base of the candle, then we take another candle and we put the wick into the flame of the one that's about to be extinguished, and we catch the flame onto the second candle, we blow out the first candle, and so now the flame has passed over to the second candle. So we could say that the flame is in continuity with the flame of the first candle. And the flame, again, it's even on the second candle, it's always changing, burning up new particles of wax, new molecules of oxygen, giving off, burning a new part of the thread of the wick. So it's a process which is always changing, and yet it appears to be the same flame because we're looking at it from a distance. But when we understand it scientifically, we see the flame is always changing. So that is like consciousness arises based on one physical body, and it's always consuming, arising through different sense organs, consuming different sense data, different objects, different ideas. And yet it seems to be the same consciousness because it's arising based on the same body. And then when this body passes away, then the consciousness passes over and grasps onto another physical body which has just come into being through the fertilization, say, of an egg. And that will start the new existence. Okay, and so according to the Buddha's teaching, underneath this rebirth process, there is a particular causal structure. And that causal structure is what I've indicated here, that we have like three stages or three aspects. The defilements are certain like qualities of mind, unwholesome qualities of mind. Particularly, we speak of craving and ignorance, or greed, hatred, and delusion as being the defilements. And out of those defilements, we engage in various activities. Those activities create karma, which I'm going to come to in a moment. And this karma, together with the defilements, will, let's say the defilements, the ignorance and craving, are the fundamental causes for rebirth, and it is the karma that determines the particular form in which rebirth takes place. Okay, so with that, we come to the next topic, which is sort of the twin topic that goes along with rebirth, and that is the topic of karma. Again, karma, it's a word which has been absorbed into everyday English usage, but often with distortions and misunderstandings in its meaning. Yeah, in popular usage, we know it most from the Sanskrit form. The Sanskrit form is karma, but in Pali, the language of the early Buddhist texts, the R gets assimilated to the M, so it comes out kamma. So the Buddha gives a very precise and a psychological, ethical definition of this word kamma. The Buddha says that it is volition that I call kamma. The word volition is a word not used very often nowadays. Let us say intention. So it's the intentional activity of the mind that creates kamma. And so when we act, our actions originate initially from intentions, from purposes, from motivations. And so we first form an intention, and then from that intention, we can act physically. If I'm angry at somebody, I want to harm them physically, I might go up to them and punch them. Before I punch them, there comes the intention, I want to harm that person. I'm going to punch them. So it's that intention of punching that motivates the physical act of punching the person. If I don't like somebody and I want to cut them down with some kind of cutting speech, first comes the intention to hurt somebody's feelings, and then that intention will express itself in that cutting, denigrating speech. If I want to cheer somebody up by speaking some kind words to them, then there will come the intention of consoling somebody, encouraging them, and that will motivate the encouraging speech. If I want to help somebody in trouble by giving them, if they're hungry, giving them a meal, there comes the intention of giving, and that manifests in the act of giving. So the decisive factor in action is the intention, the volition, the motivation. And it's the motivation that can express itself in bodily action, in speech, or even simply in thoughts. So those are the three doors of action: body, speech, and mind. But what lies behind all action what lies behind all of the actions manifesting through the three doors is the intention, the volition. And the Buddha distinguishes karma according to its intention, according to the motivation. He distinguishes it into two broad classes, which in Pali we use the words akusala and kusala. Okay, so kusala, let's say, take this one first, is wholesome, skillful, or beneficial action. And then akusala is just the opposite. Unwholesome, unskillful, or harmful action. Action that's harmful to oneself, harmful to others. And so that is the basic moral distinction or ethical distinction that we draw between different types of karma. And the distinction in the types of karma are based on the intentions or the motivations out of which those actions flow. And so what determines karma as good or bad, wholesome or unwholesome? What determines the quality of the intention are what are called the roots of karma. So the Buddha speaks quite specifically. He says that actions originate from certain forces of the mind. In those forces, he calls roots. Just as a plant grows up from its own root, so if we have the roots of a rose bush, out of that the rose bush will grow and we get rose flowers. If we have the roots of a daffodil, then out of the daffodil roots, the daffodil plant will grow, and then you get the daffodil flowers. So different kinds of actions originate from different roots, and the Buddha distinguishes the unwholesome roots from the wholesome roots. So the unwholesome roots are greed, hatred, and delusion, and the wholesome roots, the good roots, are generosity, loving kindness or compassion, and wisdom. And then from these roots, we get the main types of karma. And we find in the Buddha's discourses, again and again, he mentions certain types of actions as being unwholesome and certain types of actions as being wholesome. Okay, so what are the main types of unwholesome action? We have, in order to make it easy to remember, the Buddha uses a simple scheme of 10 types of actions on each side. So the destruction of life, taking what is not given, that's stealing, sexual misconduct. So those are 3 that are manifest through the body. Then we have 4 through speech, false speech or lying, divisive speech, speech that divides people who are in harmony, harsh speech and idle chatter, and then 3 that remain internal, dwelling in the mind, longing or greed for the possessions of others, ill will, and wrong view. And then the wholesome are exactly the 10 opposite. Abstaining from the destruction of life, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, and so forth. And then having non-greed or generosity, benevolence or goodwill, and right view or wisdom. So those are 10 kinds of wholesome, beneficial karma. Okay, now karma and the rebirth process are both very intricately linked together, so that we could say that karma is the dynamics that underlie the working of the rebirth process. And according to the Buddha's teaching, there are 5 realms into which rebirth can take place. Rebirth doesn't inevitably occur back into the human realm, but the Buddha speaks about 5 realms into which rebirth can occur. So starting from the bottom, the lowest, most unpleasant realm is called the hell realms. And the texts describe great number of hell realms with different grades of severity. But the hell realms in general, those are realms of intense pain and suffering. Those are the realms in which the heaviest type of unwholesome karma bring rebirth. Okay, the next realm is the animal realm. So rebirth can take place into the animal realm, and animals, when passing away, will be reborn in other realms, perhaps back into the animal realm, or they can be reborn elsewhere. Then the next realm, which is in somewhat closer association with the human realm, this is, I would render this, the realm of afflicted spirits. Sometimes this is translated as the realm of the hungry ghosts. And these are depicted as beings with very strong desires, particularly hunger and thirst, which they can never satisfy. Whenever they find food, the food turns to filth and they can't eat it. Whenever they find water, they try to drink it, but the water turns to disgusting snot and phlegm and urine. Okay, so those are 3 realms of suffering, or 3 realms of misery. And then we have 2 realms, which are the realms of greater happiness. One is the human realm in which we're living. And then above the human realm, there are actually a number of superior realms called the heavenly realms. The realms that are inhabited by beings, we call them devas, or divine type beings. But what's important to bear in mind, that according to the Buddha's teaching, that existence in all of these realms is impermanent. So even if a person commits the most atrocious type of evil deeds, killing and destroying the lives of hundreds of people, that person will create maybe very heavy, unwholesome karma that will lead to a rebirth in hell. But after that person spends the time in hell experiencing the results of that karma, they'll pass away and take rebirth elsewhere. And so there's no eternal hell in Buddhism, and by the same token, no eternal heaven in Buddhism. Somebody does extremely good deeds, being very generous, kind, helpful to others. That creates wholesome karma that will lead to rebirth in the heavens, one of the heavens. But after that person spends a long period of time enjoying the fruits of their beautiful deeds, then they'll pass away from the heavenly realm and take rebirth elsewhere. So existence in all of these realms is impermanent and unstable. And what determines rebirth into these realms, as I said, is our karma. So the unwholesome karma, any of the 10 types of unwholesome karma, or their variants, those are the causes leading to rebirth in the lower realms, the realms of suffering. The wholesome karma, karma originating from generosity, kindness, and wisdom, that is what leads to rebirth in the happy realms, the fortunate realms. But the ultimate aim for Buddhism is to break free from this entire process of birth and death. Because, as I said, existence, even in the heavenly realms, though it's desirable as a temporary resting place, but it's not the final goal because it's impermanent. So the final goal for the Buddha's teaching is to follow the path that leads to liberating wisdom. And it's through that wisdom that we break the cycle of birth and death and gain the ultimate freedom, which is liberation from birth and death. Okay, now I can take some questions. And I think we have another microphone that we could pass. So this gentleman in the back. But please take the microphone so the question gets recorded.
My question is, are the realms a metaphor so that the hell realm isn't actually like just a place with flames, but a metaphor for just a very difficult life, like maybe a peasant or something?
Yeah. According to the Buddhist text, they're not presented as metaphors, but they're taken to be quite literally other realms of existence.
And please, one more question.
Yeah.
I teach high school and my students always ask, and I can't answer them. They say, if more and more streams of consciousness, if through the process of rebirth, the goal is that these streams of consciousness are no longer reborn, wouldn't over time there would be fewer and fewer streams of consciousness if people are doing the right thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I would say, first let me say that the question never comes up in the Buddhist text. So I don't have a textual answer to
so my students are doing pretty good then. They're sharp.
Yeah.
They're coming up with good questions.
Okay, so this is my answer, that I would say that the streams of consciousness are infinite in number. And so as more and more streams of consciousness get liberated, there's still an infinite number of streams of consciousness remaining. That's the only answer I can give.
And I know that this is a different faith, but would you say they ask the same question in Hinduism? As the Atmans experience unification with Brahman, there's just more Atmans? There's just infinite
I think one could
Atmans?
ask the same question in Hinduism, but I don't have contact with actual Hindus, and I haven't discussed with them whether that question ever gets raised.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. Karma determines the realm into which you're reborn. Does it also determine, like, even if two people are born as humans, if one is, say, born poor and sick and in a bad country, and the other is born rich and healthy, can we assume that's because they have their actions in previous lives, or is that distinction made?
Yeah, I would say this is an important aspect of the working of karma. That karma is said to determine the differences in the fate of human beings. I don't think that karma is intended to explain everything that happens to us. In fact, that view is specifically rejected in the Buddhist texts, where the Buddha says it's not the case that everything that we experience is the result of karma. But the basic conditions under which we're born, I say some of the basic determinants of the quality of our lives, the basic, let us say, talents, dispositions, interests, capacities that we bring along with us are coming to us as the consequences of our past karma. Okay, I think Nancy, is that your name? Yeah. Okay, if you have to, okay.
Sorry, my name is John.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about unintentional
Yeah.
effects? So your intention to commit a deed, to do a deed, that's good.
Yeah.
But the result is something bad. So if you go to help someone, you help them,
Yeah.
but you find out the person you just helped
Yeah.
went across the street and murdered somebody down a road or something
Yeah.
like that. Right? Or
Okay, it's a good question. What I would say is that one could only, karmically, one can only be responsible for the intention behind the action and not the unintended consequences. But of course, from, excuse me, from a moral point of view, we have to consider possible unintended consequences of our action. But as long as we are acting with good intention, then the karma that will be created by the action will be the karma that's appropriate for good intentions. Okay, I think Nancy had, and then...
I keep wondering how meditation fits in.
Yeah.
Is it a necessity or a result of Buddhism?
A necessity or?
Well, to reach states of greater understanding.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's what we use it for,
Yeah.
but was it there first? I'm not sure. I've been wondering this all week, and I guess I don't know how to frame it.
I'm not quite sure that I get the question. Maybe you could...
I get, like, when did meditation become part of Buddhism?
Oh, meditation was part of Buddhism even before the Buddha's enlightenment. The Buddha used meditation. That was part of the ancient Indians' spiritual tradition, was to use meditation as a means to develop higher states of consciousness and realization.
Okay, thank you.
And so the Buddha, when he left the palace and became a wandering ascetic, he took up the practice of meditation under several meditation teachers.
Thank you.
I think Merit is...
Hi. My question may be limited by the worldly body that my consciousness currently occupies. But if the ultimate goal is for the liberation of the life and death cycle, and if that ultimate goal ceases that cycle, the question that comes to mind is, what's the purpose? Or what is that the end? Is this the end? You know what I mean?
Okay, maybe I'll be touching on that in the class next week. So maybe let's hold that question until next week.
I had two questions and they were asked. But I will say that, I don't know if it's common to our culture, but I certainly grew up with this, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
So this is completely kind of opposite thinking.
Except that I don't think it's really true that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think the underlying text to that is that people, if they have good intent, they might espouse good intentions, but their real intentions are harmful. So they might proclaim, oh, I'm doing this to be of so much benefit, and so to be of such a good citizen, responsible citizen, but I really am seeking to get some personal benefits for myself. Okay, so maybe we take 7-minute break or so. Was it 5 after a 10-minute break? and then we'll come back 3:15. We could come back to the meditation section. Okay, so thank you for your attention.